Number 9. Liquorkov Plant. Founded in Moscow in 1916, the Liquorkov plant built some of the country's most iconic cars, trucks, military vehicles, and other heavy equipment. At the time, it was called the Moscow Automobile Society. It was the first Soviet factory to manufacture trucks with the development of the AMO F-15, which bore an uncanny and remarkable resemblance to the Italian-made Fiat 15 truck. During World War II, the plant produced mortars and grenades for the Red Army. It also built around 100,000 vehicles that were used in the Allied war effort against the Nazis and the other Axis powers. Over the years, the factory employed 65,000 people with a 6,000-strong workforce at its height. That's a lot of jobs. This site was massive, like a city within a city, and it contained countless production units. It was said that it would take a year to walk past them all. The final car was built there in 2012. The following year, the company declared bankruptcy. Most of the buildings were dismantled, and very little of the original site remains today. Number 8. Russian Mafia Resort. Before they're able to spend any of their ill-gotten gains, organized crime groups have to somehow make their earnings appear legitimate. This process is called washing or laundering money, and there are many different ways of doing it. Back in the early 2000s, the Russian Mafia came up with plans to build a luxury resort along the Bulgarian coast specifically for this purpose. Known as Costa del Croco, this seaside holiday complex would consist of 294 upscale apartments when finished. Construction began in 2007, and not long after that, rumors began to swirl about the project being tied to organized crime. It soon came to light that a notorious mobster named Konstantin Tsiganov had come up with the idea for Costa del Croco as a front for laundering his dirty money. He used his relationships with Bulgarian politicians to invest millions into the property without falling under legal scrutiny. But Tsiganov's connections only went so far in securing his fortune. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, real estate values collapsed and people around the world stopped investing in properties. In addition to these newfound financial problems, there was a power shift in Bulgaria, and Tsiganov could no longer rely on his friends in power to overlook his money laundering activities. Construction at Costa del Croco ground to a screeching halt, leaving behind a series of unfinished seaside buildings. Tsiganov fled Bulgaria, and there's no way to retrace the financial activities revolving around the development. Ordinary investors were screwed out of the hard-earned money that they spent on what ultimately became a useless concrete and steel eyesore along the coastline. Number 7. Concepcion Station. During the 19th century, it became clear that there needed to be more options for traveling between Spain and France. At the time, there were only 2 border crossings, and they simply couldn't keep up with the amount of people who were coming and going. People love to travel, after all. Officials decided to alleviate the problem by building a grand train station in the village of Concepcion in the Spanish Pyrenees. It was meant to be a major transportation hub that would accommodate cross-border railway traffic. Concepcion International Railway Station opened in 1928. 3 years after it opened, a huge fire broke out in the lobby. It spread to other parts of the station, causing extensive damage. Then, after the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, Spanish dictator Francisco Franco had the tunnels on the Spanish side sealed to prevent gun smuggling. During World War II, both cargo and passengers passed through the station, which sat along an escape route for Jews and Allied soldiers who were fleeing the Nazis. By the 1960s, the station was in serious decline, and the future of the railway it sat along was in jeopardy. Safety concerns arose due to chronic underfunding, and in 1970 a train derailed and destroyed a bridge on the French side of the Pyrenees. The government decided not to rebuild the bridge, and without it, the cross-border rail line could no longer operate. In the meantime, the nearby village's population decreased dramatically as a result of the decline. Concepcion still serves a handful of trains on the Spanish side, but the station is mostly abandoned and derelict. It may be revived at some point, however, thanks to the ongoing efforts of the local government and funding from the European Union. Number 6. Mesen Castle. In the Belgian city of Liège, you'll find the ruins of a noble residence known as Mesen Castle. Built during the 17th century, the decaying structure was once a vast estate that belonged to the Marquis of Liège. It was destroyed and rebuilt several times throughout its history. The noble house eventually went extinct, and in 1796 the castle was repurposed as a tobacco factory. It also housed a sugar refinery and a gin distillery. Toward the end of the 19th century, a Catholic institution bought the property and added several neo-Gothic buildings to the site. From 1914 to 1970, Mesen Castle functioned as a boarding school for girls. Financed by the Belgian aristocracy, the institution was originally meant for the daughters of men who were serving in World War I. It had a strict set of rules, but gave its students a quality education, teaching them French, Dutch, math, gymnastics, theater, cooking, painting, sewing, and proper etiquette. The girls stayed at the property almost year-round, leaving only for Christmas, Easter, and summer vacation. They were allowed to have visitors once a month. Younger students were looked after by teenage mentors who helped them with basic tasks like dressing themselves and taught them how to behave properly. After the school closed, the site was given to the Ministry of Defense, which did nothing with it. Mesen Castle was abandoned entirely and became a popular attraction among urban explorers. Many people wanted to see it preserved, but the local government refused to protect it, and most of the buildings at the site were demolished. The school's chapel and a few other structures still stand, but for the most part, Mesen Castle lives on only in memory and photographs. Would you have liked to see Mesen Castle in its glory days? Do you know someone that has? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 5. Beijing Broadcasting Wall. Located off China's southeastern coast, the Kinmen Islands are governed by Taiwan. The first thing you'll notice as you approach is an eerie concrete tower with 48 circular openings that look like strange windows. But that's not what they are. Known as the Beijing Broadcasting Wall, the three-story structure is filled with loudspeakers that were used for broadcasting propaganda to the Chinese mainland. Built in 1967, it was a tool of sonic warfare, or warfare through sound. At the time, Mao Zedong was at odds with Chiang Kai-shek, a Chinese nationalist leader who opposed the implementation of communism. The broadcasting wall played music by Taiwanese artists, blared anti-communist sentiments, and invited enemy soldiers to defect from China to Taiwan. It could be heard from as far as 15.5 miles away and was used into the 1990s. At certain times, it played non-stop on a loop 24 hours a day. Can you imagine living near it? Ling Ma-ting, who used to live in the Kinmen Islands and is now in her 70s, told the BBC in 2018 that it was mentally exhausting to endure the constant barrage of back-and-forth bickering between enemies. To make matters worse, residents also had to put up with the same type of noise from the communists on the mainland. The wall still plays its original messages today, albeit at a much lower volume and as a tourist attraction, rather than an instrument for manipulating the masses. Number 4. Chateau Miranda. It's always a little sad to see a historic building fall into ruins, and it's even more tragic to see one get demolished. But it can be quite expensive to maintain old structures, and sometimes they just can't be saved, leaving demolition as the most practical and cost-effective choice. One of the saddest examples of a beautiful building that was torn down is the Chateau Miranda, a 19th century neo-Gothic castle in Belgium that was designed and built starting in 1866. It was commissioned by the Liquorkov family, who had left their previous castle during the French Revolution nearly 70 years earlier. The home had over 100 rooms and construction took a long time. So long, in fact, that it was still being built when its designer, English architect Edward Milner, died in 1884. Chateau Miranda was finally finished in 1907, when its clock tower was erected. The original owner's descendants lived in the house until World War II, when it was taken over by the Nazis during the Battle of the Bulge. In 1950, the National Railway Company of Belgium took ownership of the castle and renamed it Chateau de Noisy. It functioned as an orphanage and a holiday camp for sickly children until the late 1970s. The site became too costly to maintain and was abandoned in 1991. That same year, a huge fire majorly destroyed parts of the castle. At the time, Chateau Miranda was still under the guardianship of the Liquorkov family, who refused to let the municipal government take over the property. Nobody else wanted to invest in it, and it soon became derelict. The ceilings collapsed, and vandals hastened the castle's decay. It remained popular among urban explorers, but became a major safety concern. With its structural integrity severely compromised by all the damage it had incurred over the years, Chateau Miranda was beyond saving. Demolition began in 2016, and it took about a year for the castle to come down entirely. Photographer Matthew Hampshire had the opportunity to snap some of the last known photos of the spiraling structure before it was razed to the ground. He memorialized the crumbling castle during its final moments, ensuring that it won't be forgotten, even though it no longer exists. Number 3. Broch of Musa. During the Iron Age, a group of ethnic Scottish people called the Picts built at least 500 round hollow towers called brochs. Several of them still stand today, including the Brock of Musa, which at 44 feet high is the tallest remaining structure of its type. It's also one of the best preserved prehistoric buildings in Europe. The Brock of Musa was built around 100 BC. Like other buildings of its kind, it was made from dry stones that were pieced together without mortar. It sits on the island of Musa in the Shetland Islands and is almost entirely intact. Despite being the tallest remaining building of its type, it has one of the smallest diameters and interiors of all the surviving Brocks. This is partially because its walls are incredibly thick, which has helped to preserve the structure over time. The building's appearance has been altered several times throughout its history. There's a single entrance at ground level which consists of a 16-foot-long passage. Inside, there's a staircase that leads all the way to the top, as well as a stone bench and a hearth. When the first excavations took place in 1861, workers found a large number of animal skeletons, particularly otters. They probably lived inside the Brock after it was abandoned. The team also found a clay pot and pottery shards. Today, Musa serves as a breeding habitat for European storm petrels. There are an estimated 6,800 breeding pairs on the island, some of which make their nests inside the Brock itself. Number 2. Cambusnethan House. The small Scottish village of Overton is home to a Gothic mansion that's falling apart, but is nevertheless breathtaking. Known as Cambusnethan House, the sandstone structure was built in 1820 for a noble family called the Lockharts of Lee. At the time, the house was surrounded by beautiful, well-kept gardens. During the 1960s, the mansion served as an architect's office. The Cambusnethan House was slated for demolition in 1967, but a man named Ronald Wilson bought the property and narrowly saved it from being destroyed. He turned it into a restaurant and medieval-themed banquet hall, but numerous safety issues eventually forced it to close, and in 1985 the building was heavily damaged in a fire. There were several attempts to turn the Cambusnethan House into a hotel, but they all fell through. Safety remained a constant issue, and by 1990 the building's roof had collapsed and it had a severely cracked wall. The ruins stand today as one of the last remaining examples of 19th century neo-Gothic architecture in Scotland. Most of the buildings of this style that once stood throughout the country were demolished during the 1950s and 60s, making the Cambusnethan House a rarity worth preserving. The Scottish Civic Trust has classified the site as at risk, and a group called the Friends of Cambusnethan Priory has been fighting to save it from further decay since 2014. Number 1. Animas Forks. The houses in the Colorado ghost town of Animas Forks aren't overly impressive at first glance. In fact, most of the buildings are rather simple and straightforward, reminiscent of the days when people flocked to the area and threw together a log cabin. They were focused on trying to make it big in the mining industry, and their homes were more utilitarian than visually pleasing. In other words, it was a place to sleep between the long hours that were spent chasing after a fortune. But Animas Forks is impressive in its own right because of its altitude. At over 11,000 feet above sea level, it was one of the highest mining camps in the United States. Its population peaked in 1876 at around 450 residents. At the time, the town consisted of 30 cabins, a hotel, a saloon, a general store, and a post office, and it even had its own newspaper. Living at such a high altitude came with challenges. Every winter, residents migrated south to the town of Silverton, which was slightly warmer. In 1884, a 23-day blizzard dumped 25 feet of snow over the town, forcing locals to build tunnels to get from one building to the next. But like most mining towns, the profits dried up, and by 1920, Animas Forks was completely abandoned. Situated along a network of unpaved roads called the Alpine Loop, the ghost town attracts visitors every summer, which is the only time of year that it's reachable without a four-wheel drive vehicle. Thanks for watching. What do you think of this look at what's behind these impressive abandoned structures? Let us know in the comments down below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.